She is in the right place. And I'm not going to read through your bio just because I don't listen to that when people read them. So all I'm going to say is that she comes from a very interesting background, which I hope that you touch upon, some of your professional experiences, AmeriCorps being one of those, also working at the Case Foundation. She comes with rich experience that I think is going to inform the work that she talks about. And I had no idea that organizations like Allegheny have a resource like PACE where we can talk and be advised on how we can see our commitment to looking at justice issues in our community be seen. So really excited to hear what you got to say, and let's welcome Kristen.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And I wasn't planning on talking about a lot of my background as part of this presentation, but I will share that I've spent half of my career so far in philanthropy and half of it in civic engagement. So this role and this opportunity to be with you is deeply honoring to me because it blends so much of my interests. And one thing that I'm very proud of and want to acknowledge, because we heard a panel that so poignantly brought out why it's so important. I'm an AmeriCorps alum, and I did a year of AmeriCorps Vista at the Points of Light Foundation. Specifically, during my year at Points of Light, Hurricane Katrina happened, and I was responsible for helping steward $1 million worth of resources to communities of faith that were helping both respond to Hurricane Katrina and build capacity in faith communities to respond to future disasters along the Gulf Coast. So this event in particular, I'm excited I was able to be with you all this morning to hear some of what you're talking about, and it's just really brought home to me so much of how my interests have blended together, and thank you, Daniel, I definitely realized that I'm in the right place. So thank you all for having me. A little bit about PACE. We are, which stands for Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement. We are a network of foundations and funders that invest in civic engagement and democratic practice, which we define very broadly to include everything from political engagement, both electoral and non-electoral, to volunteering and national service, to civic learning and civic education, to deliberative democracy, to individual charitable giving, basically anything that allows people to be active participants in creating the communities that they want to be part of, whether that community is defined geographically or whether it's defined based on shared identity or shared interest. We are a diverse network in many forms. We are a national network, so we have some members who are large national foundations who come at these questions from systems levels. We have some small community foundations and mid-sized family foundations really spanning the country who all bring different strategies and ideas and approaches to their work. But the shared belief that brings them to the table at PACE is this belief. And it's a belief that America will be more healthy, productive, resilient, and successful if democracy is strong and if the office of citizen is treated as central to how it functions. So acknowledging that I was preceded by a panel from my colleague Bob at the Florida Philanthropic Network, we are similar to FPN in some ways, being both philanthropy-serving organizations. We both have members. We both seek to support philanthropic giving and figure out ways to strengthen it, whereas FPN's focus is in Florida with the kind of geographic affinity of its members. Our members' affinity is around this belief of civic engagement and democratic practice. So I'm honored to have been invited here to share some reflections with you all about some of what we're seeing and experiencing in civic engagement and democratic practice at the national level. Spoiler alert that much of this is highly related to some of what you've already heard this morning, so I will do my best to be reinforcing and hopefully be a little bit additive to some of those reflections as well. We are certainly learning a lot recently, and we are asking a lot of questions. And while we don't have a lot of answers, I'm happy to share some of what we're thinking about. So I'm going to spend my time with you over the next 20 minutes or so outlining how we have come to see and understand the dynamics that we're currently experiencing. I'm going to offer some data to contextualize it slightly, and I'm going to share the reflections that we're using to try to make some civic meaning out of this turbulent time. Excuse me. For those of us committed to the practice of democracy and the principles of active citizenship, the last year or so has been an interesting time, to say the least. But it has been interesting not necessarily because what we're experiencing is new, but rather because our work has received deeper and renewed attention that is validating of our ongoing efforts and reinforces a renewed commitment of energy and purpose. Those of us, like many of you, us and many of you in the room, who are committed to this work, uniquely know that civics is not a reactionary tactic, but it is a strategic approach that needs sustaining, nurturing, and attention and commitment over time. The practice of democracy is about people and people's ability to come together to engage for common good and common purpose, whether or not our leaders are reflective of or engaging with that people power. President Obama reminded us of this in his farewell address when he said that our country's potential will only be realized if our democracy works, only if our politics better reflects the decency of our people. And the promise of democracy lies in the resilience of its people. Or, as President Bush recently reminded us, self-correction is the secret strength of our freedom. In both that potential and that promise, and in much of the practice that we're witnessing right now from people across the country, I find room for optimism amidst the backdrop of an objectively turbulent year that feels almost daily like an emotional and intellectual roller coaster. Many have been saying that the challenges we're facing now are not new. Rather, they may be symptoms of larger diseases that have been ravaging our body politic and civic fabric for quite some time. And this perspective tends to resonate with me. It is not new that inequalities and divisive tensions are on the rise, that trust is and has been deteriorating, that demographic and sociographic changes are underway, and that Americans of all identities are questioning whose voice and whose experience matters most when determining a collective vision of greater good for our communities and our country. And it is not new that most sectors have underinvested in protecting, much less strengthening or nurturing, the collective civic mission and commitment to the greater good that our representative democracy calls us to uphold. The charge for those of us now committed to strengthening and restoring the civic mission of our schools, communities, and workplaces is whether we will be able to transform this moment into a sustainable movement with a small m, to strengthen our democracy with a small d. We didn't get here overnight, so that will take time. And at PACE, we believe that there is a role for philanthropy to create avenues and pathways for people to participate in the right and the responsibility that is self-governance. That there's a role for philanthropy to harness a sense of purpose and belonging to our community and our country. And we're committed to reinforcing a movement to revitalize our nation's civic life, or a movement of civic renewal, as Stu called out this morning, and our mutual friend Peter Levine has called us to as well. So when we ask the question, will we be able to shape this moment into a sustainable civic movement, it's important to understand where we've been in order to get perspective on where we are now. So I want to take a moment to paint a quick picture of what philanthropy's role in civics has looked like to date and what it might look like now. So the most recent national civic health data tells us that in some places, our communities and our country are incredibly strong in terms of our civic health. And in others, we have a long way to go. And when I was preparing for this speech, I was a little bit remiss that I didn't pull out the data for Florida specifically. However, my good friend, Doug Dobson from the Florida Joint Center, was really helpful in anticipating my needs and providing the wonderful infographic in your folder today. So if you are interested in digging deeper into these data and what it looks like in your community, I want to thank Doug and all of the good work that he and the Florida Joint Center have done, and also acknowledge how they have used this data to catalyze new investment, interest, and action in the form of the Sandra Day O'Connor Civic Education Act, which I know we're going to hear more about this afternoon. The best data available on what the size and scale of philanthropy's support for civic engagement looks like is captured in the Foundation Funding for U.S. Democracy tool from the Foundation Center. As with any data or classification tools, there is a debate to be had about the taxonomy that goes into classifying something like this and what counts. But generally speaking, this data gives us a helpful window. And I know that this is hard to read, so I'm going to run through it a little bit, but I'll also say this is a representation of the C3 institutional money that we can see, not necessarily the retail philanthropy or the philanthropy that we can't see that Mark alluded to on the last panel. So I'm going to unpack this for you a little bit because I know it's really hard to see, but this tool is available from the Foundation Center on their website. The two largest categories each capture about $1.3 billion in investment since 2011. The first is civic participation, which is a blanket term that they use to capture individual involvement, as well as civic learning and immigrant integration. The second, still at about $1.3 billion, is government. And in the government bucket, Foundation Center includes things like civil liberties and open data and transparency work alongside assessments of performance of the three branches of government. A close third is media, at about $1.2 billion since 2011. Within media, Foundation Center includes support for journalism and journalism education, as well as media access and media policy. The fourth category is campaigns, elections, and voting, which is $453 million since 2011. This includes both systems-level work, like campaign finance reform and election administration, as well as voter rights, access, and turnout. I'm not going to editorialize this much further, but to go from $1.2 billion to $453 million is a pretty significant drop-off that I think we all need to think some more about. And then finally, everyone's favorite catch-all, other, which I have no idea what it includes other than other, is about $311 million. So while we want to celebrate all the commitment that this data represents, given the size and the scope of many of the issues and our belief that democracy is the underpinning of all issues in our society, many groups, I think what this data shows us is that many groups working on these issues are woefully under-resourced. That said, this is self-reported data, and what counts as democracy funding is a matter of debate. Further, we don't have a lot of longitudinal data to compare trends over time in order to know how much renewed energy is coming into this arena. But I will say that Foundation Center updated this data recently to include the most recent batch of 990s, and that resulted in these numbers changing to the tune of about 520 new foundations, giving about $300 million new dollars to about 200 new grantees across the country last year. Which brings us to 2011. Brings us to 2017. That data was from since 2011. So this brings us to 2017, which is not yet represented in the tool. We are, in some ways, encouraged about the new momentum, energy, and attention that civic engagement seems to be experiencing, at least anecdotally. Some headlines suggest that 2017 could be a pretty record-breaking year for civic engagement in many respects. Eileen shared some about this surge recently on the last panel, but just a couple of things to draw out specifically. Volunteer Match reported the highest traffic on its platform in its 20-plus year history within the last year, specifically around November 9th, 2016, and January 21st, 2017. I'll let you draw your own conclusions on that. Many fundraising experts are telling us that giving in the first half of 2017 could lead to record-breaking individual giving contributions by year's end. Rallies and protests, both organized and spontaneous across many topics and issues, have seen record numbers of participants this year. And many political leadership organizations, especially those working to increase parity from women and from people of color, are seeing unprecedented levels of interest from those potentially willing to add their own names to the ballots for elected office at every level of our democratic system. Some estimates say about 13,000 women alone are considering that, and I'm sure you'll hear more about that from your dinner speaker tonight. I'm often asked how our members seek to support this work. And I should say that I don't speak on behalf of my members. Rather, I share some reflections and analysis from the vantage point that I'm blessed to sit with at the center of this network. So while it's a little imperfect, I have come to analogize what we're seeing to being a house. If democracy was a house, how would people come into it? We have some members who would come in straight through the front door. They fund things like voter registration or volunteerism or community organizing. It's very clear how the work that they're doing is civic engagement and democratic practice, so they come in through the front door, and it's just pretty clear. The second is folks who come in through what I would call a side door or maybe a window. They fund civic engagement not as an end in itself, but as a strategy to another issue. So perhaps they fund health and well-being, but they're supportive of integrated voter engagement efforts, or they fund safety and justice, and they frame their thinking in those areas through deliberative dialogues and democratic dialogues. The third are the folks that I would call the floor or the foundation of the house. Those are folks who focus on things like structural inequality or personal liberty and freedom, the values and that drive kind of our social and political process, and from which a collective sense of power and agency rise from. Without these values being the strong foundation, other elements of the house are fundamentally weakened. And then finally, the last category is what I would call the roof funders. They support the enabling conditions of democracy, things like media and journalism, or social entrepreneurship, or civic leadership. They support the things that keep the house that is democracy clean, safe, and dry. So with that kind of orientation to how we see our members coming into this work, I want to spend the balance of my time offering some reflections based on things that we are hearing and seeing and questions that we've been getting in this moment. These things are influencing a lot of our thinking and have implications for others in philanthropy, nonprofits, and others as well. I hope these might help us make meaning out of this moment and figure out how we all strengthen our work and bring others along in it in order to shore up our shared civic mission. The first is that we need a new way to talk about this work and to increase the resonance and relevance. This is a theme that's already come up several times this morning. The words that we use tend to be very academic and very elite, and can be defined in many ways that mean many different things to many types of people. And so I sometimes worry that this means that we end up talking past each other. And very few people wake up and say, I think I'd like to be civically engaged today, Or I seek to restore the social cohesion of my community. They say things like, I want to help out, right? Or I feel a responsibility to give back. And we even often hear foundations say, I didn't set out to fund civic engagement, and I definitely don't use those words to talk about it, but I have come to the realization that actually is what I'm doing. So at PACE, one way that we wanted to respond to some of the questions that we were receiving was by creating what we've come to call a civic engagement primer. I think Bob and Stu included this in some of the pre-materials, so some of you may have seen this already. But what the primer intends to do is level set some of the values around the terms that we use and spark a conversation for those who seek to understand how their work fits into the civic engagement ecosystem. We hope that it is an inclusive and representative frame to capture the spectrum of activities that contribute to both the right and the responsibility of democratic practice. But we did launch this to be a conversation starter, not a definitive resource. So if, as you engage with it, you have feedback for us, please reach out to me, because I definitely like to hear it to make sure that it is as inclusive and representative as possible. The second reflection is one that I've come to after being regularly asked, why now? If the problems that we're experiencing aren't new, what is different in this moment that is increasing the saliency and urgency of engagement for people? And while I'm certainly not a sociologist or a political scientist, what I'm starting to wonder is if we're seeing the inherent tension of a representative democracy versus a direct democracy. People on all sides of the proverbial aisle feel that the representation that they have is not representing them. And through their actions, they are pleading for a more direct, immediate, and accountable outlet for their concerns and values. And they're willing to play an active role in ensuring that those values are lived out. Even when people vote for representatives, they're unlikely to agree with their decisions 100% of the time. So I think that this means that there's a salient opportunity to ensure that we're promoting civic engagement in all its forms, including those that go beyond the voting booth, to ensure that civics is a regular, timely part of everyday life. We often get asked how to stay nonpartisan in civic work, especially in this deeply divisive time. First, I think it's important to recognize that partisan and political are not the same thing. And second, this leads me to the third reflection that I will offer, which is that as institutions, we may need to redouble our efforts to stay above the partisan fray by leading with our values, and also by being honest and transparent if there are specific outcomes that we are trying to generate. This is particularly challenging right now, given that everything feels partisan and tribal, but at its core, civic engagement is not telling people what to think or how to feel or how to act, but it is about building a sense of agency and purpose and generating a sense of belonging and commitment to something larger than themselves, and giving them the space and trust to act in the ways that are most meaningful to them. Civic engagement is often as much about the process as it is about the outcome. And so as institutions, we may need to engage in both the process and the outcome with equal intentionality and ensure we're not too prescriptive about the outcome, that we're not maintaining the integrity of the democratic process by putting people at the center instead of ourselves. This is pretty closely related to my fourth reflection, which is that in the complexity of the times that we live in, the issues that we're facing and the dynamics that we're experiencing may require us to lead with questions and resist forced binary answers. Many of us know that democracy as a process is inherently and necessarily messy. That is a feature, that is not a bug. So we may need to get more comfortable sitting in gray areas and having uncomfortable conversations that allow for perspectives and experiences that we might not always feel comfortable with. That does not necessarily mean that we need to fully validate or embrace those perspectives, but it does usually mean that we are called to acknowledge and understand that they exist and why they do, and not just pretend that they're not there. And then finally, what I think this all bubbles up to is that we're starting to see what I hope is a collective cognitive or paradigm shift in something that many in this room have known for a long time, and Billy actually scooped me on a little bit earlier, which is realizing that civics is not the nice, cute thing that we do on the side of our necessary work. Civics is the necessary work. For any issue that we care about to be sustainable, it must engage people in being part of naming the problem and identifying and leading the solution to it. Civic engagement is not a piece of the pie, it's the pan that all the pieces sit in. So I started by speaking of being optimistic about the potential, the practice, and the promise of our democracy. And the reason that I can be optimistic is that beyond sitting in a privileged position that allows me to do so, it's because of the work of leaders and institutions like all of you that are working on a daily basis to do what Benjamin Franklin charged us to do, to keep our republic. So I want to close by saying thank you for all that you do, and I'm so honored to be your colleague in this work. Thank you. Easy questions only, please.
Easy. All right, everyone put their hands down. Any questions for Kristen? Sure.
Thank you for that engaging speech. We were talking a little bit in our breakout session earlier about the importance of institutions in really crystallizing and reinforcing anything, whether it be civic engagement, philanthropy, volunteering. So I'm wondering, as it relates to civic engagement, if you could comment a little bit about how important it is that the call to action come from an institution, whether it be, we talked about higher ed, K-12, religious, or even local government.
Mm-hmm. So how important is it that the institution issue the call? I think it depends on the communities that you're working in, and understanding if the communities that you're trying to reach and the people that you're trying to reach, for them, will an institution be a trusted and credible messenger? And if so, it's both about the message, it's about the call, and it's also about the messenger, right? So how do we understand to whom or for whom can the most trusted messages be delivered with the most validity and the most impact? Sometimes I think that can be institutions in the traditional way that many of us think about institutions. Sometimes I think it can be more informal through community leaders or kind of trusted, people who have been almost deputized in some ways to be an institutional leader of a community. So I'm not sure that I can answer that specifically. I think it just depends on who needs to hear what and from whom.
Hi, Kristen.
Dan, you got to give me an easy one.
I was
Daniel.
going to say, we're compadres, so I'm going to try to make this
We're fast friends. Let's not mess
easy. No, thank you very much for your presentation. I really appreciate all 5 of your reflections. And, we're doing community-based, place-based giving in very specific communities. Eileen talked about that. And so your list kind of talks about a lot of the principles that we talk about to make sure that we're not bringing our own agenda into the communities, but that we're really building it from the inside up, right? Your last one, though, I'm going to try to make this is the one that resonates most with me, and that is that this work can sometimes get messy, as you say. And I think your reflection was move from nice to necessary. But even when I find that you have civically minded institutions and organizations like Allegheny Franciscan Ministries, we still have our constituents, and we still have our boards, and we still have our brand. And sometimes being nice is expected. And so what advice and or just opinions or ideas do you have around this idea? How do you move from nice to necessary without alienating individuals? Yeah.
It's a really good question. And I probably should clarify a little bit that I didn't mean nice as in, like, let's stop being polite, because I'm also from the South, so I know that's not an option, right? Bless your heart. So that actually played really well. I'm pretty happy with that. So I think one of the most equalizing things that I think we've seen watching our members' experience is kind of the concept of deliberative dialogue, which is, I really hate that term because it's like talk about super academic, jargony terms that don't resonate with people, right? But really at its core, it's kind of getting people around a table and saying, what matters to you? How are you feeling? What's going on? What matters to you? How are you thinking about it? And so there's a real way to kind of level set around that still makes people feel included in the process. It makes it feel like their voice and their experience and their opinion matters. That can still be nice because that's the right thing to do, but it's also necessary to say we're not coming in to tell you as a community what the problem is and how we're going to solve it, but we're engaging you in the necessary process of hearing your voice around these issues. So one example, one of our members is the Kettering Foundation based in Dayton, Ohio, and they work a lot with the National Issues Forums to do lots of framing and dialogue guides around how do you have some of these really difficult conversations around really prickly and complex issues. And they did one around safety and justice, where they expected to come into the room hearing a Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter debate, right? And when they actually sat people down and framed the question as, how do we make sure everybody comes home safely? It completely allowed people to let their guard down a little bit around, okay, this is the shared goal that we're both working for, right? Like, this is what we both want, or what we all want, because I'm even trying to resist my own binary language of both being an either or. But how do we get at what collectively it is that we're all seeking and really value and level set around that? So when they did that and they were able to break out of the Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter dichotomy, they were able to, everyone at that table was then able to see, oh, we want the same things. We have the same shared values. What's necessary for us? Like, what do we need to get out of this? What are we not willing to compromise? And what are we maybe willing to give up a little bit in terms of ideological purity even, or like vantage point, in order to find some sense of common ground? So that's just one example. Does that help, Daniel? Great.
Any other questions? Ralph. You have to introduce yourself, Ralph.
Hi, I'm Ralph Becker from Salt Lake, where people are also nice.
Bless their hearts. In a good way this time.
What's that? Yeah, there you go. Appreciate your comments. Question about philanthropy a bit, but also I see kind of going on all over the country the kinds of things that we're talking about here. And it's this undercurrent. And I guess I'm wondering if you've given thought, or through the philanthropic world, about how you bring this to scale so it's not an undercurrent but becomes the mainstream.
Mm-hmm. It's a really good question, and I think we're starting to question if scale is all it's cracked up to be in the opposite way, right? So I think right now, what we used to think about, and how many of us used to think about scale, right, was how do we test and try this one thing in this one place and then see how we grow and expand it to other places. I think right now there's been a little flip of the funnel on that, where we're seeing a lot of foundations and funders say, how do we actually, if we think about these things as big, scalable, huge issues, how do we actually really boil it down to understand what it is that we're dealing with and what it is that we, and how we can have the most impact on a local level. So it's almost like I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it. but I think a lot of funders are starting to think about it differently, as if we can't solve the national crisis that is the opioid epidemic, how do we start in one community and see what works there? And then how do we think about rescaling that? So it's almost like scaling down to scale back up in some ways, if that makes sense. Because I think one of the things that we're seeing and that we're experiencing is that a lot of the problems are shared, but a lot of the solutions are not necessarily based on history in certain communities, culture in certain communities, social dynamics in certain communities. So I think people are walking back a little bit, I'm not diminishing the idea of scale, but kind of walking it back a little bit to say, can we rethink what it means to scale and where and how we do it most effectively? And if we want to have meaningful traction on some of these issues, how do we not start small and work up, but how do we start big and work down to figure out how we really contextualize some of this? Does that make sense?
Okay. Kristen, I think, thank you.
Am I off the hook now?
You are, you're off the hook.
Thank you.
Thank you.